I was on trial for a crime I didn't commit, framed by a prejudiced cop. But when he finally pushed me, he made one critical mistake. He kicked the wrong man. The air in the courtroom was thick and stale, a nauseating cocktail of old paper, cheap floor polish, and quiet desperation. It's a smell I'll never forget. I sat at the defendant's table, my back ramrod straight, my hands resting calmly on the polished wood. My lawyer, a young public defender named Sarah, who looked like she was barely out of law school, kept shooting me nervous glances. She wanted me to look penitent, maybe a little scared. I couldn't give her that. Fear wasn't in my programming anymore. All I could give her was control. Cold, hard, disciplined control. It was the only thing keeping me from screaming. On the witness stand was Officer Miller. He was a bull of a man, with a thick neck that strained against his uniform collar and a smug little smile that never quite left his lips. He was weaving a masterpiece of fiction, painting me as a violent, aggressive thug he'd heroically subdued. He used all the right words. Uncooperative. Belligerent. Furtive movements. He described the traffic stop, conveniently leaving out the fact that he'd pulled me over for having a decorative license plate frame from my alma mater, a flimsy pretense if I ever heard one. He failed to mention that my furtive movements involved me reaching slowly and deliberately for my registration in the glove box, exactly as he'd instructed. And when you asked the defendant to step out of the vehicle, the prosecutor asked, his voice smooth as silk. Miller puffed out his chest. He became verbally abusive, Your Honor, cursing, threatening me. I recognized the signs of a dangerous individual. In my experience, a man like that, from that part of town, is usually armed and looking for trouble. A man like me. That part of town. The coded language was so loud it was practically a siren. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place cops were supposed to protect. But the jury didn't know that. They just saw me, a 6'2" black man in a cheap suit, sitting opposite a decorated police officer. The math was simple, and it wasn't in my favor. I could feel my heart rate, a steady 60 beats per minute. In training, they'd submerge us in freezing water, subject us to disorientation and sleep deprivation, all to teach us to control our body's response to stress. Sitting here, listening to this man dismantle my life with casual lies, was harder than any of that. Every instinct, honed over a decade of service in the most hostile environments on the planet, was screaming at me. Assess the threat, neutralize the threat. But I wasn't in a dusty village in some forgotten corner of the world. I was in a courtroom in my own country, and the rules of engagement were maddeningly, terrifyingly different. Sarah did her best on the cross-examination. She was smart, detail-oriented. She pointed out the inconsistencies in his report, the fact that his body cam had mysteriously malfunctioned right before the supposed altercation, the lack of any other witnesses. But Miller was a pro. He batted away her questions with condescending ease, calling her ma'am, in a tone that dripped with derision. He smiled at the jury, a friendly, reassuring cop just doing his dangerous job, and I could see them buying it. I saw the nods, the tightened lips of disapproval aimed in my direction. They were seeing the monster he was describing, not the man sitting 10 feet away from them. Finally, the prosecutor rested his case. The people have nothing further, Your Honor. The judge, a weary-looking man named Thompson, nodded. We'll take a 15-minute recess before the defense begins. He banged his gavel, and the low hum of conversation filled the room. Sarah gave my shoulder a squeeze that was meant to be comforting, but felt more like a confirmation of our impending doom. Just hang in there, Marcus, she whispered. We'll get our turn. I just nodded, my eyes locked on Officer Miller as he stepped down from the witness stand. He was triumphant. He walked past the prosecutor's table, receiving a congratulatory pat on the back. His path to the courtroom exit took him directly past me. I didn't look at him. I just stared straight ahead at the state flag hanging limply behind the judge's bench. I was a ghost, an object, the subject of his testimony. That's all I was. As his polished black shoes came into my peripheral vision, he slowed. I could feel his presence, hot and suffocating. He leaned down, his voice a venomous whisper, meant only for me. Should have stayed on your leash, boy. We'll make sure they put you in a nice, tight cage. My blood went cold. The word boy echoed in the chambers of my mind, a sonic boom of disrespect that years of discipline couldn't entirely contain. My training, my entire being, screamed at me to remain impassive. Do not react. Do not give him what he wants. But my body betrayed me. A tremor of pure, unadulterated rage shot through me. I didn't say a word. I didn't even turn my head. I simply stood up, I had to. I had to put some space between his poison and my sanity. It was a slow, controlled movement. My hands were at my sides, open and non-threatening. But it was all the excuse he needed. "He's lunging for me," Miller roared, his voice suddenly filled with manufactured panic. The entire courtroom, which had been buzzing with quiet chatter, went silent. Everyone's head snapped in our direction. Before Sarah could even shout, "No!" Before the bailiff could take a single step, Miller's leg shot out. It wasn't a panicked reaction. It was a practiced, precise, brutal move. A full-force kick, the kind you use to break down a door. The polished leather toe of his boot connected squarely with my shin, sweeping my leg out from under me. The sound, a sickening, hollow thud, cracked through the silent room. I saw the flash of triumph in his eyes, a glint of pure, unadulterated hate, just as the world tilted, and I went down, crashing hard onto the cold linoleum floor of the courtroom. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. It was followed by a silence so profound I could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I lay on the floor, not stunned, but processing. The pain was a sharp, electric spike in my shin, but it was distant, secondary. My mind was already running threat assessments, calculating angles, and most importantly, suppressing the overwhelming urge to get up and show Officer Miller what a real threat looked like. My body was a weapon, and the first rule of any weapon is control. You don't fire indiscriminately. Sarah was by my side in an instant, her face pale with shock and fury. "Marcus, are you okay? Your Honor, did you see that? He assaulted my client." "I saw him lunge," Miller bellowed, trying to seize back control of the narrative. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me. He was coming at me. I was defending myself. But the lie was too big, too brazen. We had all seen me simply stand up. The bailiff, a burly man who had been watching the proceedings with bored indifference, now had his hand on his sidearm, his eyes darting between me on the floor and a suddenly frantic-looking Officer Miller. "Silence!" The judge's voice was no longer weary. It was a crack of thunder that shook the room. Judge Thompson was on his feet, his black robes billowing as he leaned over the bench, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His eyes weren't on me. They were locked on Miller. "Officer Miller, you will stand down. Right. Now." Miller's mouth opened and closed like a fish, his bravado instantly evaporating under the judge's fury. I held up a hand, stopping Sarah from helping me up. "I'm okay, Sarah," I said, my voice perfectly level. It didn't even tremble. Years of speaking over the roar of helicopter rotors and the crackle of comms had taught me to command my voice in any situation. It cut through the tension with surgical precision. All eyes, including the 12 jurors who looked utterly bewildered, fell on me. Lying there on my back, I looked past Miller, past the stunned prosecutor, and directly at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, my tone respectful but firm. "With all due respect to the court, I believe Officer Miller's testimony may have just become compromised, as has his conduct." Judge Thompson's glare at Miller intensified. "The court is inclined to agree, Mr. Hayes. Are you injured?" Here it was. The moment. The pivot. The fulcrum on which this entire farce would turn. I could have said yes. I could have milked the injury, played the victim. But that wasn't the mission. The mission was to reveal the truth. Not just about the traffic stop, but about the man Officer Miller had tried to create in this courtroom. "The pain is manageable, Your Honor," I said calmly. "However, I am more concerned about the damage to United States government property." A murmur went through the jury box. The prosecutor frowned, looking completely lost. Sarah looked at me, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning curiosity. "Government property," the judge repeated, his brow furrowed. "Yes, sir," I said. I pushed myself up into a sitting position, my movements deliberate and smooth, showing no sign of the searing pain that was now beginning to pulse from my lower leg. I looked down at my shin. The fabric of my cheap suit pants was torn, and through the rip, something was visible. Something that wasn't skin. It was a dark, woven material, scuffed and scraped from the impact. Officer Miller's kick, while inaccurate and poorly executed, appears to have caused significant cosmetic and possibly structural damage. I reached down to the hem of my pants. Every sound in the room seemed to die away. The shuffling of papers, the clearing of throats, the hum of the lights, all of it gone. There was only the soft rustle of fabric as I began to slowly, methodically, pull my pant leg up past my calf. First they saw the socket, a custom-molded composite cup that encased what remained of my leg just below the knee. Then they saw the pylon, a sleek black shaft of carbon fiber. And then, as I continued to roll the fabric higher, they saw the entire apparatus, a complex, beautiful, and terrifying piece of technology, a gleaming network of microprocessors, pneumatic joints, and titanium struts, all culminating in a flexible footpiece designed for running, jumping, and moving silently through the dark. It was the furthest thing from a human leg. It was a piece of military hardware. I stopped when the whole thing was visible, a stark and alien contrast to the wood-paneled, tradition-bound courtroom. I let the sight sink in for a long, heavy moment, before I looked back up at the judge, my voice as cold and hard as the metal now exposed for all to see. "This," I announced, my voice echoing in the dead silence, "is a Mark IV Mod II custom biomechanical prosthetic, issued to me by the Department of Naval Special Warfare." The silence that followed my statement was different. It wasn't the silence of shock or confusion anymore. It was the silence of a narrative being violently, irrevocably shattered. The 12 jurors stared, their mouths slightly agape, their eyes wide. They weren't looking at a thug from that part of town anymore. They were looking at something else entirely, something their minds were struggling to categorize. The prosecutor looked as if he'd been slapped. His carefully constructed case, built on innuendo and stereotypes, had just been demolished by a piece of carbon fiber and titanium. But my eyes were on Officer Miller. The smugness was gone. The bravado, the casual racism, the swagger. It all bled out of him, leaving behind a pale, sweating man who looked suddenly small and weak in his pristine uniform. He stared at my leg, at the gleaming prosthetic, with a kind of primal horror. It was the look of a man who realized he hadn't just kicked a defendant. He had kicked a hornet's nest the size of an aircraft carrier. Naval Special Warfare. Judge Thompson's voice had lost its thunderous anger. Now it was laced with something else: awe, respect, and a heavy dose of judicial fury. "Mr. Hayes, are you telling this court that you are a United States Navy SEAL?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady. I slowly lowered my pant leg, the cheap fabric covering the advanced technology once more. It felt like putting a mask back on. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hayes, retired, 10 years of service, multiple deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations I'm not at liberty to disclose in an open court. Sarah, my public defender, was staring at me as if she'd never seen me before. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it shouldn't matter, Sarah," I said, loud enough for the jury to hear. "My service record, my commendations, my injuries, none of that should have any bearing on whether or not I was speeding. The law is supposed to be blind. Officer Miller's testimony should stand or fall on the facts, not on who I am or what I've done." I let my eyes drift over to the jury box. But I think we've all just seen that for some people it does matter. It matters a great deal. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. They knew exactly what I meant. They had been seeing me through Miller's prejudiced filter. Now, that filter was gone, and they were looking at the raw, unfiltered truth. "Bailiff," the judge commanded, his voice sharp as broken glass, "take Officer Miller's sidearm. He is relieved of duty, pending an internal investigation which I will personally be requesting from the Chief of Police this afternoon. Officer, you will remain in this courtroom until these proceedings are concluded. Do you understand me?" Miller, looking utterly defeated, nodded numbly as the bailiff approached him and unholstered his weapon with a practiced click. The sound was deafening in the still room. It was the sound of a career ending. "Your Honor," the prosecutor stammered, scrambling to his feet. "In light of this new information, the state would like to request a recess to reconsider its position." "You do that," Judge Thompson said, his voice dripping with ice. "But first, I want to hear from Mr. Hayes." "Son," he said, his tone softening as he addressed me, "would you be willing to take the stand?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said without hesitation. I stood up, ignoring the dull throb in my real leg and the phantom ache in my prosthetic. I walked to the witness stand with a steady, even gait that belied the machinery hidden beneath my trousers. There were no limps in my programming. Every step was a testament to the engineers at Walter Reed who had helped put me back together. As I passed Miller, I didn't look at him. He was no longer a threat. He was just a footnote. I took the oath, my hand steady on the Bible. I sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the courtroom. It was a completely different room now. The jury was leaning forward, hanging on my every move. The prosecutor was desperately whispering with an assistant, and the judge was looking at me with an expression of profound seriousness. The stage was mine. "Chief Hayes," the judge began, his voice formal but respectful. Please tell the court, in your own words, what happened on the night of your arrest." "Yes, Your Honor," I began. I detailed the traffic stop, my voice a calm monotone, just as I would in a mission debrief. I described Miller's immediate hostility, the way he'd shone the flashlight in my eyes, his demanding tone. I explained how I had clearly announced my intention to retrieve my registration from the glove box, and how I had moved slowly and deliberately to do so. "And what happened when he ordered you out of the car?" the judge asked. I complied immediately, Your Honor. I placed my hands on the roof of my vehicle as instructed. He performed a pat-down which was unnecessarily rough, but I did not resist in any way. It was at that point his body camera mysteriously suffered a technical malfunction. I paused, letting the implication hang in the air. He began to verbally berate me, using racially charged language. He called me a thug, asked what I was doing in his neighborhood. He was trying to provoke a reaction. "And did you react?" "No, Your Honor. I am trained to de-escalate hostile situations." I remained silent. The story was unfolding, piece by painful piece. But the most important part, the part that would explain everything, was yet to come. "Your Honor," I said, leaning forward slightly, "there is something else you need to know about that night. Something that explains why I was out driving at 2 in the morning in the first place. I wasn't just aimlessly cruising, as Officer Miller's report suggests." My eyes found Sarah's. She gave me a slight, encouraging nod. "I was on my way home from a meeting at the VA hospital. A late-night support group. You see, the reason I have this—" I tapped my prosthetic leg lightly, the sound a dull thud in the quiet room. "It's not just a physical injury. It comes with other things. Things you can't see." I took a deep breath. This was harder than talking about any firefight. "My team and I were on a mission in the Korengal Valley. We were ambushed, an IED. I was the point man. I looked directly at the jury, making eye contact with each of them. I lost my leg that day, but I also lost 3 of my brothers, men I had served with, bled with for years." My voice for the first time began to waver, just a fraction. "And that night, the night Officer Miller pulled me over, it was the anniversary of that ambush. It was the day my brothers died. The courtroom became a vacuum, every molecule of air and sound seemingly sucked into the raw, gaping wound I had just opened. The jurors who had been watching me with a mixture of awe and pity now looked humbled. I saw one woman in the back row dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The prosecutor had stopped his frantic whispering and was just standing there, his mouth slightly ajar, the papers in his hand forgotten. This wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. It was about honor, sacrifice, and a profound, shattering grief. "I suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, Your Honor," I continued, my voice regaining its composure. The clinical term felt inadequate, like trying to describe a hurricane with the word windy. It's a constant battle. The hypervigilance, the nightmares, the anxiety. The support group helps. Talking to other vets who get it. That's where I was. That's why I was on the road. I was driving home, trying to keep the ghosts at bay for one more night. I turned my head slightly, enough to look at Officer Miller. He was slumped in his chair, his face ashen. He refused to meet my gaze, staring intently at the scuffed toes of his polished shoes. So when Officer Miller approached my car with such aggression, yelling, shining his light in my eyes, it triggers a response. My training kicks in. My heart rate spikes. My body prepares for a threat. But my mind is screaming to stay calm, to follow the rules, de-escalate, comply. Because I'm not in the Korengal Valley anymore. I'm in America. I'm home. I'm supposed to be safe here. I let that last sentence hang in the air, a quiet indictment of the whole proceeding. "And you're telling this court," Judge Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion, "that despite your training, despite your PTSD being triggered by the officer's aggression, you remained completely compliant." "Yes, Your Honor. 100%. I gave him no reason to escalate the situation. I gave him no reason to arrest me. And I certainly gave him no reason to lie under oath and manufacture a story about me being a violent criminal." My gaze hardened as I looked back at Miller. "I have fought for this country. I have bled for the flag that hangs behind you, Your Honor. I have seen real danger. I have faced real evil. Officer Miller, he is not a brave officer facing down a threat. He is a bully with a badge who saw a black man in a decent car, in a nice neighborhood, and decided I didn't belong. His report is a work of fiction. His testimony was perjury. And his assault on me in this courtroom, in front of you and the jury, is the only piece of genuine evidence of his character that has been presented today." The silence that followed was broken by a sniffle from the jury box. "Thank you, Chief Hayes," the judge said quietly. "You may step down." As I walked back to the defendant's table, the entire atmosphere had changed. People looked at me differently. I wasn't an accused criminal anymore. I was something else, a symbol. Sarah put a hand on my arm, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Marcus, I am so sorry," she whispered. "I had no idea." "You're a good lawyer, Sarah," I told her. "You fought for me even when you thought I was just some guy in a jam. That means more than you know." The prosecutor approached the bench looking like a man walking to his own execution. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The state of California moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Hayes, with prejudice." "With prejudice," the judge repeated, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "So noted. The charges are dismissed. Mr. Hayes, you are free to go. And you leave this courtroom with the profound gratitude and respect of this court, and I hope of your country." He banged the gavel, a sharp, final sound. "This court is adjourned." It was over, just like that. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. People in the gallery started to clap. Softly at first, then louder. The jury members were smiling at me, some of them nodding in respect, but I wasn't looking at them. My attention was focused on the bailiff, who was now helping a dazed Officer Miller to his feet. Miller looked completely broken. His career was over. He was facing charges for perjury, assault, filing a false report. His life as he knew it was utterly destroyed. And for a fleeting moment, I felt a sliver of something that resembled pity. He was a man poisoned by his own hate, and now he was reaping the consequences. As the bailiff led him toward a side door, a man in a sharp dark suit who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom for the entire proceeding stood up. He was tall, with graying temples and an air of quiet authority that made him stand out from the rest of the spectators. He intercepted the bailiff and Miller, flashing a badge and speaking in a low, urgent tone. The bailiff nodded and handed Miller over to the man in the suit. It was strange. He didn't look like a local cop or a DA's investigator. He looked federal. The man in the suit glanced over at me, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and escorted Miller out of the courtroom. I frowned, a prickle of unease running down my spine. Something wasn't right. Sarah was packing her briefcase, beaming. "We did it, Marcus. Well, you did it." That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen in a courtroom. "Who was that guy?" I asked, nodding toward the door where Miller had disappeared. "Who? Oh, I don't know. Probably an internal affairs detective. Don't worry about him. Miller's going to get what he deserves. Let's get you out of here. You're a free man." She was right. I should have been celebrating, but my training had taught me to recognize when a situation felt off, when the pieces didn't fit. A local cop committing perjury and assault wouldn't typically warrant this kind of immediate, discreet federal attention. I shook the feeling off. Paranoia, hypervigilance. The ghosts of the Coringal Valley were still with me. We walked out of the courtroom into the crowded, noisy hallway. Reporters were already swarming, shouting my name, shoving microphones in my face. Sarah tried to shield me, but it was overwhelming. And then, through the chaos, I saw him again. The man in the dark suit. He was standing by the main exit, waiting, and he wasn't alone. Standing next to him was another man, someone I recognized instantly, even though it had been years. My blood ran cold. It was Commander Thorne, my former commanding officer from SEAL Team 3. The man who had written the after-action report on the ambush that took my leg. The man who knew every classified detail of my service, including the missions I couldn't speak about in open court. He wasn't smiling. He just looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes, and gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. And in that moment, I knew. This was never just about a traffic ticket. Miller hadn't just stumbled upon some random veteran. He had kicked a man who was carrying secrets far more dangerous than any weapon he could imagine, and my old bosses had just arrived to clean up the mess. The cacophony of the hallway faded into a dull roar. The reporters, the flashing cameras, Sarah's concerned voice, it all became background noise. My focus narrowed to a single point. Commander Thorne, standing there like a ghost from my past, a living embodiment of the world I had fought so hard to leave behind. Hypervigilance wasn't paranoia when the threat was real. "Marcus, who is that?" Sarah asked, following my gaze. "Do you know him?" "He's an old boss," I said, my voice low. "I need to go talk to him, alone." "Are you sure? You don't have to talk to anyone." I gave her a reassuring look I didn't feel. "It's okay, Sarah, trust me. Thank you for everything, I mean it. You were ready to go to war for me." "You went to war for all of us," she replied, her voice soft. Go. I'll handle these vultures. She turned and began addressing the press, creating a much-needed diversion. I moved through the throng, the crowd parting before me as if sensing I was on a different vector. As I approached, the man in the suit gave a slight nod and melted away, leaving me alone with my former commander. Thorne looked older. The lines around his eyes were deeper, his hair more silver than I remembered, but his eyes were the same sharp, analytical, missing nothing. "Hayes," he said, his voice the same gravelly baritone I'd heard over countless comms channels. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement. "Commander," I replied, my posture instinctively straightening into a more formal stance. Old habits die hard. "What is this? What are you doing here?" "Damage control," he said bluntly. He gestured with his head toward the courtroom. "You made quite a scene in there, waving around naval special warfare property like a flag, talking about deployments. You know how sensitive that is." A cold anger began to replace the shock. Sensitive? A racist cop tried to frame me for a crime I didn't commit and assaulted me in a court of law. I used the truth to defend myself, that's all. "The truth is complicated, Hayes." "You know that better than anyone," Thorne countered, his gaze unwavering. Officer Miller wasn't just some random beat cop. He was under long-term federal observation, part of a domestic extremism task force. We've been tracking a network of white supremacists who have infiltrated local law enforcement agencies across the state. Miller was a key player, a recruiter. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The immediate federal presence, Miller's extreme, unprovoked aggression. He wasn't just a racist. He was a true believer, and he had seen a target. "So he targeted me deliberately?" I asked, the full weight of it hitting me. "He ran my plates, saw my name, and decided to make an example out of me?" "We believe so," Thorne confirmed. "He was looking to provoke an incident, create a martyr for his cause, or at the very least get a decorated black veteran locked up to serve as a trophy. He was trying to prove a point to his buddies. When you stood up in court, he saw his last chance to create the narrative he wanted. He never in a million years imagined what was under your pant leg." I looked down at my leg, hidden again beneath the cheap fabric. My prosthetic. My wound. The thing I had often seen as a symbol of my failure to protect my men. In that courtroom, it had become my shield. "The case against him was circumstantial at best," Thorne continued. "Mostly chatter, online posts. Hard to make a conviction stick. But what he did today... perjury, assault on a federal officer." "I'm retired, Commander," I cut in. Thorne gave a thin, humorless smile. "Chief Hayes, you never stop being a SEAL. And that prosthetic is technically still government property. Kicking it is legally tantamount to striking a federal agent. Thanks to you, we now have him dead to rights on charges that will stick. He's in federal custody, and he's already singing, trying to cut a deal. You just single-handedly decapitated a very dangerous domestic terror cell." I stood there, processing it all. The traffic stop, the arrest, the humiliation. It hadn't been random. It had been the front line of a war I didn't even know I was fighting, a war that had followed me home. "So what now?" I asked. "Do I have to testify again? Disappear into a witness protection program?" The thought was exhausting. "No," Thorne said, and for the first time his expression softened slightly. "You've done enough. We'll handle it from here. The records will be sealed. As far as the world is concerned, this was just about a dirty cop getting what he deserved. Your part in the larger investigation will remain classified." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple business card. "But I have a proposition for you. The skills you have, the discipline, the ability to stay calm under fire. We could use a man like you, not in the field, not anymore, but as an instructor, at the farm, teaching the new generation how to handle the kind of psychological warfare you just endured, how to de-escalate, how to control the situation when the enemy is hiding in plain sight." I looked at the card. It was blank except for a phone number, an offer, a way back into the world, but on my own terms, a way to turn the worst day of my life, and the daily battle that followed, into a lesson for others, to teach them how to fight the ghosts. For the first time since I'd entered that courthouse, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. The weight I'd been carrying for so long felt a little lighter. Miller hadn't just kicked a black man or a veteran. He had kicked a Navy SEAL, and in doing so, he hadn't broken me. He'd reminded me, and the whole world, exactly who I was. Not a victim, not a thug, but a warrior who had found a new battlefield, right here at home. I took the card from his hand. "I'll think about it, Commander," I said. He nodded, the closest he would ever come to saying, "Thank you." "That's all I ask. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the courthouse crowd as seamlessly as he had appeared. I stood there for a long moment, the sounds of the hallway slowly returning to focus. I looked from the card in my hand to the exit, where the bright California sun was streaming in. The ghosts of the Korengal Valley were still there, I knew. They always would be. But for the first time in a long time they were quiet, and as I walked out into the light, a free man, I felt like I finally had my marching orders.